Hello and welcome to this live broadcast from St Lawrence, Catford. This is a live video, so there's plenty of scope for things to go wrong, so who knows what will happen. Now, what I'd like to do is to look at the readings for this coming Sunday. If you'd like to download a copy, I've put a copy up on the parish website, stlawrencecatford.org.uk. And if you go to the home page, you'll find the link at the top of the page. Just click where it says Get Sunday Readings or something like that. And you can download a copy of the readings, which you can follow as I'm talking about them. Alternatively, I will read them out, so you can find out what they're about in any case. The first reading on Sunday from the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, is actually a really important reading for understanding both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The reason they put this reading for the Sunday before Christmas is because in order to understand who Jesus was, what he said about himself, and what the first Christians believed about him, you have really to understand this passage, because it's a really important part of Old Testament thinking. So, 2 Samuel chapter 7, I'm going to read part of the passage so that you can follow what's being said. It's about King David. Once David had settled into his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all the enemies surrounding him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "Look, I'm living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God dwells in a tent." Nathan said to the king, "Go and do all that is in your mind, for the Lord is with you." So it starts off by David saying, I'm dwelling in a house, in a palace possibly, whereas the ark of God, the ark of the covenant, which contains the 10 commandments which God himself had inscribed in stone on the top of Mount Sinai, which was the very heart of the people of Israel, the spiritual heart. This was in an ark, in a tent. So, at this stage, to understand the reading this far, you need to know that the date is very roughly 1000 BC, one of the easiest dates in history to remember. It's about 1000 BC, and King David has just conquered the city of Jerusalem. It was formerly lived in by a tribe called the Jebusites. But David defeated the Jebusites and took this apparently impregnable city by getting his men to crawl up a very narrow passageway which the Jebusites hadn't defended. And so David had conquered Jerusalem, and he made Jerusalem his capital city and renamed it the City of David, a name it had ever afterwards, really. And the city of Jerusalem is on top of a hill. The hill is called Mount Zion. And so Zion becomes another name for Jerusalem. And we'll come back to Zion at the very end of this little meditation. So there is David settling into his newly built palace, perhaps in the middle of Jerusalem, his new capital city. And he says, it's a bit unfair that I'm living in a nice house, while the Ark of the Covenant itself, the most precious thing we have, is still in a tent. And he says this to the prophet Nathan, his advisor. Nathan says, that's fine. You go off and build God a nice house, build him a temple. But the story continues. That very night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, thus the Lord speaks. Are you the man to build me a house to dwell in? So God says to Nathan, go and tell David, I'm having doubts as to whether you're really the right person to build me a house, to build me a temple. And he explains why. I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be the leader of my people Israel. If you remember, David started off life as a shepherd, which came in handy when it came to fighting with Goliath. God continued, I've been with you on all your expeditions. I've cut off all your enemies before you. So that's the past. And then God goes on to the future. I will give you fame as great as the fame of the greatest on earth. I will provide a place for my people Israel. I will plant them there, and they shall dwell in that place and never be disturbed again. Nor shall the wicked continue to oppress them, as they did in the days when I appointed judges over my people Israel. So there's the past. God has been with David in his military campaigns. There's the future. He's going to settle his people in a firm, secure place where they won't be disturbed. And he continues, I will give them rest from all their enemies. And then God concludes to Nathan to tell David, the Lord will make you great. The Lord will make you a house. And then he concludes, and when your days are ended and you are laid to rest with your ancestors, I will preserve the offspring of your body after you and make his sovereignty secure. So he goes on to say to Nathan, to tell David, when you've died and your days are ended, I will make sure that you have an heir to the throne, the offspring of your body, someone directly related to your son, and I will make his sovereignty secure. So I'll make sure that he becomes king without any problems. I will be a father to him, and he a son to me. Your house and your sovereignty will always stand secure before me, and your throne be established forever. Now that's quite a promise God is making to David here. He's saying, not only will I put a son on your throne when you're dead, who will reign securely, but also, he goes on to say, you will always have an heir to sit on the throne in the city of David. Your house and your sovereignty will always stand secure before me, and your throne be established forever. So God is promising to David that there will always be a descendant of his to sit on the throne in Jerusalem. Well, as I say, that's quite a promise. And so what this passage is doing, at least to start with, it's playing on three meanings of the word house. It starts off with David living in a house in Jerusalem, a reference to his palace, to his home. David then goes on to say he wants to build God a house. So he wants to build God a temple. So we've had house as home or palace. We've had house as temple. And now God goes on to promise David that he will make his house. The Lord will make you a house. In other words, house in the sense of dynasty or family. And that dynasty will be secure forever in the eyes of God. So we move from house as home to house as temple to house as family, or in this case, house as dynasty, all David's successors for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so what God is saying to David is this, really. I don't want you to build me a house, to build me a temple. Rather, I am going to build a house for you, house in the sense of dynasty or family. And the house that God builds for David, God promises, will be eternal. It will continue forever. Now, it's interesting, though, that Nathan persuades David to change his mind and not to build God a temple. Because even when David was at his height, there was still a very firm tradition in Jewish thought that maybe it was right that the Ark of the Covenant should have no fixed abode, should spend its life being carried round in a tent, being carried round in a desert. That somehow it was sacrilegious to build God a temple, because that's the sort of thing that the pagan tribes did. That's the sort of thing the Canaanites did, the people among whom those first Israelite tribes were living. They were all for building temples, and in Jewish thought there was a tradition that maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't build a temple for God, because God wasn't really that sort of God. temples were for idols, whereas God was much happier off dwelling in a tent than he was in a palace or a temple. Well, the issue was resolved when they moved the Ark of the Covenant into the temple, which was built by Solomon, by David's son. But that's another story, really. But in a way, that tradition that Nathan represents were, of course, correct. Because the Jerusalem temple really didn't last forever. If this was 1000 BC when all this happened, even as early as 926, the temple was raided by the Egyptians and looted and pillaged. And in 587 BC, some 400 and something years later, the temple was actually destroyed by the Babylonian army, and all the royal family were killed off. All David's descendants, the kings of the time, were polished off by the Babylonians, at the same time as they destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and the entire population was sent off into exile into a vast refugee camp somewhere outside Babylon. 50 years later, of course, a new temple was built in 537 BC, but even this temple only lasted some 500 years or so, and in 70 AD the story came to a sad end when Titus, a Roman general, demolished Jerusalem and burnt down the temple for the last time, and it was never rebuilt. There's a tradition that the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, which you can see even to this day, where pious Jews go to say their prayers, that this is all that remains of the Second Temple, this once great and glorious building, just reduced to some large stones. So those who were warning about confining God to a temple were perhaps correct, because the temple never did last that long, really. And once the temple was destroyed, if you felt that that was where God resided above all else, what did it say about God? If the temple, which was your firm foundation of your religion, was destroyed by your enemies, did that mean your God had let you down? That your God wasn't as powerful as your enemy's God? That he'd allowed himself to be defeated? What did it mean? Well, as things got worse and worse for the people of Israel, as the succession of David's heirs, one after the other, got increasingly worse and worse, and the Bible is full of woeful tales as you read the Old Testament, as to how one king was worse than his predecessor, with very few exceptions. So people's hopes began to evolve. And above all, people held firm to this promise that God had made to David. Your house and your sovereignty will always stand secure before me, and your throne be established forever. And they clung to those words, forever, because if God made a promise, God could not be wrong. God had said David's throne would be secure forever, and therefore it must still be somewhere around the place. And if it wasn't here and now, then it must be coming very shortly. And so, directly from this, there developed the tradition of the coming Messiah. Messiah, as those of you who were in church for the first Mass last Sunday will have heard me explain, Messiah is Hebrew for the Anointed One. It's the same word as Christos in Greek, or Christ, the word we're more familiar with. Both Messiah and Christ mean the Anointed One. And the Anointed One was the King of Israel, because to become king you had to be anointed with holy oil. That was a sign of your kingship. It wasn't so much a question of wearing a crown, more a question of being anointed with holy oil. But if there was no anointed king around the place, then what was God doing about this promise that he'd made that there would always be a king? And so people began to pin their hopes on a coming Messiah, an anointed one who hadn't arrived yet, who was on his way, God's very own king, who was going to come and whose reign would last forever. And so for hundreds of years, there was this expectation that the Messiah would come, that God's promise would one day be fulfilled, that a descendant of David, one of his dynasty, one of his house, would ascend his throne and rule forever. And so we can turn now to Sunday's Gospel and read this familiar passage perhaps with fresh eyes. It's the story of the Annunciation from St. Luke chapter 1, 26 and following. I'll just read the first half. The angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David. The house of David, note. And the virgin's name was Mary. He went in and said to her, "Rejoice, so highly favoured, the Lord is with you." Mary was deeply disturbed by these words and asked herself what this greeting could mean. But the angel said to her, "Mary, don't be afraid. You've won God's favour. Listen. You are to conceive and bear a son, and you must name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David. He will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and his reign will have no end." Ah, did you spot it? Not only was Mary of the house of David, or betrothed, at least Joseph was, Mary was betrothed in this version to a man named Joseph of the house of David. But it goes on to say about Mary's promised son, Jesus, "The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David." So we know all about that now, don't we? Know that about the messianic promise, that God promised that the once and future king, the Messiah, the Christ, would sit on the throne of David. Well, here is the angel Gabriel promising to Mary that her son will have the throne of his ancestor David. So he is of the dynasty of David, and not only that, he will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and his reign will have no end. And so now suddenly these words begin to resonate in a new and quite unexpected way. We're so familiar with this sentence of the angel Gabriel, but now we can begin to understand the particular resonance that it would have had for the people of Jesus' time. Because he's going to rule over the house of Jacob, in other words, the children of Israel, forever. And his reign will have no end. And remember the promise that God made to King David in 2 Samuel. "Your house and your sovereignty will always stand secure before me, and your throne be established forever." So here we are. Mary is being told that if she says yes to what God asks of her, her son will be the Messiah, the long expected and waited for descendant of the lineage of David, whom God had promised would reign forever. And suddenly we begin to understand how Mary would have heard the words of the angel. And yet, even if Mary's son was the once and future king, as Christians, what we believe, he didn't show much sign of it in his life. He never sat on a throne. He never lived in a palace. He hardly ever even went to the temple, except to overturn the temples of the money changers by the sound of things. In fact, he had no home at all. He had no house. Unlike King David, even King David had a house. Jesus had no house. He was an itinerant preacher who lived way up in the North Country and died outside the city on a cross. Jesus' life was much more like that of the Ark of the Covenant, travelling round the desert in a tent, than it was like the house that King David planned to build for God. So it's hardly surprising that so few people recognised him as the Messiah, when apparently he filled very few of the criteria. And yet, Christians down the ages have discovered, actually, that God's throne is not a particular place, a particular chair, in a particular building, in a particular temple, in a particular city. God does not dwell in buildings made by hand. God actually dwells in human hearts. And this is what Jesus, the Messiah, came to reveal to us. That God is as close to us as the human heart. No need to go to Jerusalem or even to Buckingham Palace to find where God dwells. God is with us here and now. But not only with us. This is a promise for all people, for all the peoples of the world, that God is close to them, closer than they realise, without any pomp or circumstance, quietly with them, in them, living with them and speaking to them if they have ears to listen to what he says. And then a final twist in the story. At the very end of the Bible, the last chapter in the Bible, what do we find? What do we find in Revelation chapter 21? Then I saw, says St. John the Divine, a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had disappeared, and I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, dressed for her husband. And so, at the very end of the Bible, we have once more a house, a city where God and humanity can dwell together. Because in this New Jerusalem, there is no temple in the city. A voice said, "Look, here God lives among human beings. He will make his home among them. They will be his people, and he will be their God, God with them." And so here we are at the very end. We all get a house, God and human beings, all able to dwell together in the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, the city without a temple, because God dwells in the hearts of all his children, all recognise him, worship him, and find his love there in their hearts. May God bless you for the rest of this Advent, and may you discover God in your heart and in your home this Advent and this Christmas forever. Amen.